Global integration practically erased those huge political empires from the previous century. The First World remained stable, the Second World cracked under the stress of the 1970s Cold War, the Third World sorta cracked as some areas became advanced and others sank into poverty. The end of the Three World Order organized a new system, a unified marketplace with flows of capital, culture, and commerce across the borders. In 2000, many societies endorsed electoral systems, and some had versions of a market economy. These forces started to affect the autonomy of nation-states. Education, wealth, and political rights expanded. Globalization wasn't as easy as it sounds. Just kidding, it doesn't even sound that easy. But there were some serious obstacles that hindered on globalization. There were Cold War tensions. Additionally, the arms race created monetary trouble for the Soviet Union and the US. Moreover, the Soviet bloc collapsed, exposing its shortages, lack of healthcare, and corruption. The breakup of the Soviet Union also created political and economic stagnation. Communism, unable to adapt to technological changes, could hardly sustain itself. Over in Africa, only a few of their colonial experiences still existed. Some states were still ruled by white governments. However, when the de Klerk arranged for free elections in reaction to the harsh measures against Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, it drove white leaders out of power. Most of these African states had trouble building their economies while at the same time avoiding Cold War rivalries and integrating different people into their states. However, much they tried though, ethnic and local rivalries prevented peace and stability within Africa. There were many distinct agents that all contributed to globalization at the end of the 21st century. The largest agents were finance, trade, migration, culture, and communication. By the 1970s, the increased flow of goods and services around the world was already well underway, but the fall of communism removed many impediments to the world financial system. Although leadership among developing economies was taken on by non-state entities such as the International Monetary Fund, huge banks in London, New York, and Tokyo, among other places, set the rules for the new global financial order. Although this new order led to more connectedness, it also led to more interdependency, along with more people doting businesses around the world with less oversight. Another facet of the New World financial system was the rise of East Asia, which increased production and management, becoming leaders of the new century. Another major agent of globalization was worldwide migration, which increased precipitously after 1970. A common migration path was reverse colonial, meaning that residents of former colonies would migrate back to former colonists. For example, places in Africa back to Europe. Outside of this, migration around the world increased, with several countries, such as the USA and Japan, struggling to integrate immigrants. Overall, though, increased migration led to diversification and unification around the world, hence globalization. A third and final agent of globalization was mass culture and communication, which led to a mass common culture around the world. New technologies in the 1970s, such as the cassette tape, transmitted culture such as music, television, and clothing around the world. This led to a uniform global culture, which oftentimes reflected only the United States culture being exported around the world. Global culture led to the defense and celebration of local culture in some places, but at the end of the day, a uniform global culture led to increased globalization in the world at the end of the 20th century. Expanding populations, change in families, and widespread globalization transformed the world into a new global order. Since people are living more and less deaths are occurring, the population surged dramatically, with wealthy and poor nations showing slower growth rates than Asia, Africa, and Latin America. For wealthier nations, which, thanks to birth control pills and altered views on women, declining birth rates came as a matter of choice and lifestyle. Families are now more fluid, with more divorces and out-of-wedlock births. With new medicine, old people storm the earth. They live longer and create a larger burden on families and society, which produces a need for welfare programs. Epidemics have been held in check in modernized cities, but developing nations have had troubles with diseases. AIDS was a big thing during this time as well. In terms of education and rights for women, in some areas like India, women lagged behind. In the US, women had college degrees and had more opportunity despite remaining gender biases. China's education also made great progress, but not so much in their rural areas. Women are now in the workplace in large numbers, but not equal to men yet in positions and wages. This sparks feminist movements that were particularly popular in the 1970s. Production and consumption have also changed remarkably. Agricultural production chemistry and biology have accelerated agricultural production, primarily in America and Asia. Americans produced a lot, but they also consume a lot of H2O energy and fossil fuels. In 1991, this in turn led to the Gulf War. Oh yeah, awareness and problems relating to pollution and radioactive waste was part of the new global order too. Globalization in the New World Order posed its problems, rooted in the unequal distribution of benefits. Global organizations were created to solve crises, and there were some pros and some cons to these groups. Many of them succeeded in their missions and brought democracy, stability, and better rights to suffering countries, yet some intruded on national sovereignty, namely the World Bank and the IMF. Another problem is that citizenship in the global world created were the wars that raged across the world. In the 1990s, Yugoslavia broke up into different ethnic groups that sought the other's blood. War ensued that caused over a 90% civilian casualty rate. In Africa, there were unstable states that didn't have the natural resources or government to handle all of their problems. A vicious war broke out in Rwanda, where over 800,000 people were killed. People also looked to religion to redefine morality in the 20th century. In India, the BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party, rose to dominance in the late 80s as an anti-Muslim group. They claimed that the government had favored Muslims, the minority, at the expense of Hindus. Religion was also a way to resist globalization. In the Middle East, globalization represented a materialistic and individualistic movement, and they continued to denounce it as they had been doing since the 1800s. In Iran, people used religion as a means to seize political control. A large group accused the Shah of breaking Islamic rules and forced him out in 1979. Ayatollah Khomeini took charge and changed Iran to a theocracy. Religion also played a big role in the U.S., with a coalition called the Moral Majority rose up, denouncing practices such as abortion, certain sexual relationships, and other non-Christian values. Lastly, democracy was a system that organizations looked to define and request nations to adopt. China was the exemption to the global trend. Rejection of the multi-party system, increased wage gap, and poor living conditions led to peasant uprisings and student activism. At Tiananmen Square in April of 1989, over 100,000 people demonstrated for more than one party and more rights. The response was not what the people wanted. Basically, a bunch of hunger strikes and more protests would ensue. The rest we'll just have to see. In Mexico, after over 70 years of fixed elections and other acts of corruption, the country adopted a democratic system.